11 years ago, a 24-year-old woman and a 25-year-old man vanished from the bedroom of their shared home in Durango, Colorado. It happened overnight, in late October 2015, in a quiet mountain town where doors were often left unlocked and neighbors recognized each other by the sound of their footsteps on wooden porches. Elise Hill and Ralph Allen were last seen where they should have been safest, inside their own apartment, tucked into the ordinary rhythms of a young couple building a future. By morning, both were gone. There were no signs of a struggle loud enough to wake the neighbors. No shattered glass. No screams carried into the cold mountain air. Local police initially leaned toward uncertainty rather than violence. Maybe they left voluntarily. Maybe a late-night drive. Maybe a misunderstanding that would correct itself by afternoon. One person close to them never believed that explanation. Not for a second. The case would sit unanswered for years, then decades, its edges softened by time and dust. And when it finally shifted, when truth forced its way back into the light, it would be because of a routine modern process that required biometric data, colliding without warning with a fragile trace preserved from that long-ago night. No one in 2015 could have predicted that a system designed for efficiency, not memory, would one day reopen a door that had been closed for far too long. Before the disappearance, Elise and Ralph lived a life that felt provisional in the way young adulthood often does, busy, hopeful, not yet hardened by disappointment. Durango wrapped around them with pine-scented air and the steady presence of the Animas River cutting through town. Their apartment sat on the second floor of a modest building not far from the edge of the residential grid, where pavement gave way to dirt paths and trailheads. Inside, the space was small but intentional. Second-hand furniture, a kitchen table scarred by use, gear stacked neatly against the wall, boots drying by the heater, backpacks leaning like they were ready to go at a moment's notice. Elise was a graduate student, focused and quietly resilient, splitting her days between classes and a part-time job at an outdoor retail store. She moved through the world with a measured optimism, the kind that came from believing effort mattered. Ralph worked as an entry-level IT technician, introspective and curious, more comfortable listening than talking, often absorbed in systems, how things connected, how problems could be solved if you understood the structure underneath. Together, they balanced each other. They planned hikes weeks in advance. They talked about moving somewhere with more space, maybe closer to the mountains, but still tethered to community. Their evenings followed a familiar pattern. Dinner after long days. Shared silence that felt companionable, not empty. The soft glow of lamps reflecting off old wallpaper. Outside, Durango settled early in late autumn. Night temperatures dropped fast. Sounds carried farther, passing trucks on the highway, the distant bark of a dog, wind moving through cottonwoods. Inside the apartment, the world narrowed to routine and trust. There was nothing about that night that announced danger. Nothing that would have warned them that safety can be thinner than it appears, that the boundary between ordinary life and irreversible loss can be crossed without noise or spectacle. Only later would small details take on weight, the way the building faced the street, the predictable timing of lights going dark, the assumption that familiarity equaled protection. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? Elise and Ralph's home life was structured by small, dependable rituals that gave shape to their weeks. Mornings often began before sunrise, especially when Elise had early classes. The apartment filled with the muted sounds of preparation water running in the sink, the click of a kettle, the rustle of notebooks sliding into a worn backpack. Ralph usually lingered a few minutes longer, checking messages or weather reports on his phone, already thinking several steps ahead about tasks waiting for him at work. They moved around each other with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms without needing to speak. The apartment itself was simple but warm. The living room doubled as a workspace, with Ralph's laptop often open on the coffee table beside a tangle of charging cords. Elise's textbooks and annotated articles were stacked neatly along one wall, marked with color-coded tabs. Their bedroom sat at the back of the unit, partially shielded from the street by a line of trees and a shared backyard space below. The bed faced a window that overlooked a darkened yard, its curtains thin enough to let in the pale wash of moonlight and the occasional glow from a neighbor's porch lamp. Their closest bond was quiet, but deeply rooted. They were not demonstrative in public, but at home they shared long conversations about the future, where they might live, how they wanted their lives to feel rather than simply look. Elise talked about finishing her degree and finding work that let her stay close to the outdoors. Ralph imagined advancing in his field, gaining stability, building something dependable. They disagreed sometimes over money or timing, over how quickly to take the next step, but those frictions felt normal, even reassuring. They were proof that the relationship was real, not idealized. Around them moved a loose orbit of other people. Neighbors passed on the stairwell with polite nods. Maintenance workers came through the building during the day to check plumbing or heating. Customers and co-workers drifted in and out of Elise's days at the store. Ralph's job put him in contact with clients he rarely met in person, names and problems moving across screens rather than faces. None of these interactions felt threatening. They blended into the background noise of adult life, ordinary and unexamined. There were vulnerabilities, though they barely registered at the time. The back door to the building was often left unsecured, especially during the day, because residents trusted one another. The bedroom window faced an area that was not well lit at night. Their routines were predictable: lights out around the same time. Weekends often spent hiking or resting after long weeks. Predictability felt like stability. It did not feel like exposure. On the evening before they vanished, Durango was quiet in the way mountain towns often are once the sun drops behind the ridgeline. The air cooled rapidly, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. Elise came home from work tired but satisfied, her shift uneventful. Ralph arrived shortly after, shoulders slumped from a day of troubleshooting problems that never fully resolved. They cooked a simple dinner, ate at the table with the radio playing softly, and talked about nothing urgent. Later, they prepared for bed as they always did. Doors were checked but not double-locked. Curtains were drawn partway. Outside, the neighborhood settled into stillness. Inside, the apartment glowed briefly with lamplight before going dark. The last sounds were familiar ones: the creak of the floor, the low hum of the heater cycling on against the cold dot. It was an evening indistinguishable from dozens that had come before it. That sameness was its comfort. It was also what made the loss so complete. When morning came, the routines that defined their lives would have nowhere to land, and the quiet that followed would be louder than any alarm. October 23, 2015 unfolded without ceremony. The day carried the muted energy of late autumn, when the town seemed to pause between seasons. Elise attended her classes in the morning, taking notes with the focused precision that had become second nature to her. Ralph spent the day at his office, troubleshooting network issues, answering tickets, and waiting for problems to resolve themselves. There were text messages exchanged about dinner plans, nothing remarkable. Nothing that would later feel like a final statement. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped, and clouds gathered over the mountains, casting long shadows across the streets of Durango. Evening settled in early. By 7:30 p.m., porch lights flickered on up and down the block. Elise returned from her shift at the outdoor store, her jacket smelling faintly of wool and cold air. Ralph arrived shortly after. They ate together, cleaned up, and spent a little time scrolling through messages and planning the next weekend. Their voices were low, relaxed. The apartment absorbed their presence, every sound familiar: untouched. By 10:45 p.m., the building had grown quiet. Most of the neighbors were asleep. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, stirring branches that brushed softly against one another. The yard behind the apartment fell into shadow, broken only by a single security light near the alley that flickered inconsistently. Inside the bedroom, Elise and Ralph prepared for sleep. The lamp on the bedside table cast a warm circle of light over the room before it clicked off, leaving only darkness and the faint glow from the window. Sometime after midnight, something shifted in the adjacent unit. A resident later described half waking in the night with a sense that something was wrong. There was no clear sound to pinpoint, just the impression of movement where there should have been none. In the darkness, a shape seemed to pass across the window, blocking the faint light for a moment before it was gone. The resident lay still, heart racing, telling themselves it was nothing more than a trick of sleep, a shadow from a tree, the mind filling in gaps. By morning, the certainty of what they had seen had already begun to erode inside Elise and Ralph's apartment. The night left no obvious disturbance. No neighbors reported shouting. No one recalled hearing doors slam or glass break. Whatever happened unfolded with quiet control, in a space where trust and routine had lowered every internal alarm. The morning of October 24 began with absence. When Elise failed to show up for her scheduled shift, her manager tried calling, assuming oversleeping or a last-minute change of plans. When Ralph did not log in remotely for work, a coworker sent a casual message. The apartment remained dark. By mid-morning, concern replaced patience. A family member arrived first, unlocking the door with a spare key. The apartment looked untouched. The bed was empty. Phones were gone. Wallets remained behind. Shoes sat where they had been left the night before. Panic moved quickly, filling every corner of the space. Calls were made. Names were shouted into rooms that did not answer back. The yard was searched. The stairwell echoed with hurried footsteps as the realization took hold that Elise and Ralph were not simply late or unreachable. Fear hardened into certainty. Something had happened in the hours when the town slept. By the time the first patrol car turned onto the street, its lights reflecting off parked cars and dark windows, the sense of normalcy that had defined their lives had already collapsed beyond repair. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. The first deputy arrived just before noon, stepping into an apartment heavy with unanswered questions. He moved carefully through each room, noting what was present as much as what was missing. The living space showed no signs of a struggle. Furniture was undisturbed. Dishes from the night before sat clean and stacked by the sink. In the bedroom, the bedspread was rumpled but not torn, pillows slightly displaced as if two people had simply risen and left. Windows were checked. The back door to the building drew quiet attention. Its lock functional but easily bypassed if left unsecured. A second unit arrived shortly after, followed by the sheriff, a steady presence in a town where serious crime was rare enough to feel personal. Statements were taken in the living room, voices low, everyone struggling to keep timelines straight. The adjacent neighbor described the vague nighttime impression, waking suddenly, sensing movement, seeing what might have been a silhouette crossing the window. The account was written down carefully, even as it was treated with caution. Sleep plays tricks. Memory bends under stress. Still, it was recorded. By early afternoon, the search expanded beyond the apartment. Officers walked the immediate perimeter, checking the yard behind the building and the narrow alley that ran alongside it. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, offering help, scanning the ground with anxious eyes. Word spread quickly through Durango. Volunteers arrived without being asked, some bringing dogs, others simply willing to walk until there was no ground left unchecked. near the edge of the yard, just beyond where the grass gave way to packed dirt. A volunteer spotted something out of place. A single item lay partially hidden among fallen leaves, a lightweight jacket Elise often wore during evening walks. It was damp with dew, its sleeve twisted unnaturally, as if dropped or pulled free. A few feet away, the soil showed a faint scuff, a disturbed line running toward the alley. It was shallow, easy to miss unless someone was looking closely. The discovery shifted the tone of the search. This was no longer about finding two adults who might have left on their own. K-9 units were brought in, their handlers moving slowly as the dogs lowered their noses to the ground. The scent trail was weak but present, leading briefly down the alley before dissolving into nothing. Nearby, officers photographed a set of footprints pressed into soft earth, adult-sized, deliberate, not hurried. Close to the fence line, a small patch of grass lay flattened, bent under weight, suggesting someone had paused there, knelt, or adjusted their grip. Each detail was documented with the tools available at the time. Photographs were taken. Measurements were estimated. Evidence was bagged and labeled. It was careful work, but constrained by the era and the assumption that answers would come quickly, that the search would not stretch into weeks or years. As daylight faded, the sheriff stood near the cluster of findings, hands on his hips, staring down at the disturbed ground. The evidence told a quiet but unmistakable story. Elise and Ralph had not wandered off together in the night. They had not left willingly. Whatever had taken them had done so deliberately, efficiently, and close to home. The fear that settled over the town that evening was different from panic. It was heavier, slower. People locked their doors. Porch lights stayed on. Conversations dropped to whispers. The mountains surrounding Durango felt closer, their dark outlines pressing in as night fell again. By the second morning, the tone inside the sheriff's office had hardened into grim focus. Maps were spread across desks. Photographs from the yard and alley were laid out in sequence. The jacket, the scuffed soil, the footprints, the flattened grass, each piece was examined again, this time as part of a single narrative rather than isolated anomalies. The conclusion formed quietly but decisively. Elise Hill and Ralph Allen had been taken by force. The case was formally reclassified from a missing persons inquiry to an abduction. That designation changed everything. A list was drawn up of people who had legitimate access to the building or reason to be nearby during the night hours. Maintenance workers who knew the layout. Neighbors with irregular schedules. Delivery drivers who passed through after dark. Co-workers or acquaintances who might have known the couple's routines. Each name carried a different weight, and none were dismissed lightly. One individual quickly rose to the top of the list. A man who had been in and out of the building for routine maintenance work, familiar with the back entrance and the blind spots in the yard lighting. He had been seen in the area the week before, asking casual questions about residents and schedules. When brought in for questioning, his timeline shifted in subtle but noticeable ways. He accounted for his movements broadly, not precisely. Small details did not line up cleanly. The interview stretched on, tension thickening as investigators pressed for clarity. Yet suspicion alone was not enough. When physical evidence was compared, it failed to align. The footprints found near the fence line did not match his shoes. A verifiable record placed him miles away during a critical window of time, corroborated by multiple sources. The inconsistencies that had raised alarm ultimately pointed not to guilt, but to human error and anxiety under pressure. The suspect was released, the file updated with careful notes. The process, though frustrating, reaffirmed the limits of what could be proven. The search widened. Crews combed the surrounding woods, the riverbanks, abandoned sheds, and service roads leading out of town. Volunteers rotated in shifts, exhaustion setting in as hope thinned with each passing hour. State investigators were consulted. They reviewed the evidence and noted the controlled nature of the abduction. No frantic trail. No discarded items beyond the initial sight. No witnesses who could place a vehicle or identify a face. Whoever had done this knew the terrain and moved without panic. Days turned into weeks. Leads dried up. Tips came in and led nowhere. There was no ransom demand. No credible sightings. Technology that might have helped widespread surveillance. Digital tracking, integrated databases was either limited or non-existent. Eventually, the decision was made to scale back active operations. It was not framed as giving up, but it felt like it. For Elise and Ralph's families, time fractured. Each unanswered phone call reopened the same wound. Birthdays passed. Seasons changed. The sheriff carried the case with him long after official efforts slowed, replaying decisions in quiet moments, wondering what detail might have been overlooked. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. The case file was placed into a manila folder, labeled with 2 names and a year. It slid into a storage box among others just like it, then onto a shelf in a room few people visited. The door closed. The light went off, and for a long time, nothing moved. Time moved forward in ways the case could not. Inside the sheriff's office, leadership changed, desks were reassigned, and filing systems were reorganized as paper slowly gave way to digital records. The storage room where Elise Hill and Ralph Allen's file lived was flooded once during a spring thaw. Boxes lifted hardly onto metal shelves to keep them dry. Years later, a roof leak forced another reshuffling. Old cases were evaluated for destruction, their relevance questioned. Somehow, this one survived each near erasure, saved less by intention than by hesitation. 2 names written together made people pause. Outside the station, Durango changed. New buildings rose. Old trails were rerouted. People who had searched the woods in 2015 moved away, aged, or died. Elise's parents kept her childhood room intact for years before finally repurposing it, folding grief into something quieter but no less heavy. Ralph's family marked holidays with an empty chair, his absence woven into every gathering like a silence no one knew how to fill. They learned to live without answers, though they never stopped wanting them. The deputy who had first walked the apartment eventually retired. In idle moments, he still thought about the jacket in the leaves, the footprints that went nowhere, the neighbor's uncertain memory of a shadow. He wondered whether believing that witness more fully might have changed something, whether insisting harder on some other angle could have shifted the outcome. The questions stayed with him because they had no place to go. Meanwhile, somewhere else, another life unfolded, one that never intersected with the missing person system in any meaningful way. Under a different name, Elise and Ralph existed as records that did not quite align. School enrollments supported by documents that raised small, fleeting doubts. Employment forms filled out with information that was technically valid, but emotionally hollow. Addresses that changed often enough to avoid scrutiny. The era allowed it. Counties did not talk to one another. States did not share data seamlessly. Missing adults, especially couples, slipped through cracks more easily than anyone wanted to admit. Under that imposed identity, time passed unevenly. Memories surfaced without context, snow against a window that did not match the current home. The smell of pine triggering a physical ache with no explanation. There was a constant sense of being slightly out of place, of performing a life rather than inhabiting it. Questions formed, but could not be asked safely. Answers felt dangerous. Back in the station, the box remained closed. It was moved once more during a renovation, set briefly on a cart under fluorescent lights before being returned to a shelf. The labels faded. Tape yellowed. Inside, evidence bags crackled with age. their contents frozen in the assumptions of another time. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? No one in that room knew that the answers were still alive, carrying their own weight of confusion and loss. No one could have known that a system designed decades later would one day force a reckoning, not through memory or confession, but through data. For now, the case remained officially dormant, its truth suspended between what was recorded and what was never understood. Under names that were not their own, Elise and Ralph grew older in a life that never fully fit. Records showed them as individuals who appeared suddenly, already formed, with pasts that were thin and difficult to trace. Paperwork smoothed over inconsistencies. A new birth certificate issued late. A social security record that began years after it should have. In school, questions were answered with rehearsed explanations. In adulthood, those same explanations followed them from lease to lease, job to job, always sufficient, never complete. They lived carefully. Too much curiosity felt dangerous. Too many details invited scrutiny. The person who controlled their early years insisted on silence, on gratitude, on obedience, framed as protection. Over time, the immediate fear softened into something more corrosive. Constant low-level disorientation. Elise felt it when people talked about childhood memories with clarity and certainty she could not access. Ralph felt it when paperwork asked for places and dates he knew were wrong, but could not correct. They learned to accept that unease as permanent. The decades passed unevenly. They built routines. They worked. They paid taxes. They existed in systems that recorded their presence, but never questioned its origin. Teachers noticed that Elise struggled to answer personal history assignments. Supervisors noted Ralph's reluctance to discuss his past. These were filed away as personality quirks, nothing more. No one had the tools, or the mandate, to connect two quiet adults to a cold case that had long since slipped from public memory. By the time they reached middle age, the world around them had changed. Databases merged. Fingerprints were digitized. DNA testing moved from rare to routine. Identity became something that could be verified at a molecular level, not just attested to on paper. It was this shift impersonal, procedural, that finally closed the distance between past and present. The trigger came after a death. The person who had controlled their early lives passed away, leaving behind modest assets and legal complications. To resolve the estate, Elise and Ralph were required to submit fingerprints as part of an inheritance verification process. It was framed as routine, standard compliance. Nothing to fear. In a government office under flat fluorescent light, their prints were scanned and uploaded. The process took minutes. The clerk moved on to the next task without comment. Somewhere else, miles away, servers processed the data automatically, comparing it against millions of stored records. There was no human intent behind the comparison, no sense of anticipation. Then the system flagged a match. One of the fingerprints aligned with a partial print, lifted from a jacket recovered near an abduction site in Durango, Colorado, in October 2015. Another correlated with a smudged print preserved on evidence tape from the same scene. The probability exceeded every threshold. The software generated an alert and attached it to a case number that had not been opened in years. At a desk in a different jurisdiction. A cold case notification appeared on a monitor. A name no longer in circulation. 2 victims listed as missing. A status marked inactive. The alert cut through decades of silence in a single line of text. A modern investigator leaned closer to the screen, reading and rereading the details. The past, long dormant, had just identified itself, not through memory, not through confession, but through the quiet certainty of data finally catching up. The cold case investigator approached the reopened file with deliberate care. Years working dormant cases had taught them that time did not erase truth, it only obscured it. When the alert came through, they did not rush. They requested the physical box from storage, signing it out like a fragile artifact. When it arrived, the cardboard edges were soft, the ink on the label faded but still legible. 2 names, 1 date. A case that had been waiting. Inside, the contents were methodically laid out. Photographs from the yard and alley were scanned at high resolution, their grainy textures sharpened by modern software. The jacket was removed from its aging evidence bag, fibers carefully sampled without disturbing what remained. Soil embedded in the seams was collected and logged. The flattened grass pattern, once dismissed as incidental, was digitized and overlaid with contemporary terrain models of the neighborhood. Every note was read line by line. The uncertain witness statement about a silhouette near the window was revisited, no longer treated as unreliable, but as incomplete. The investigator cross-referenced utility records, rental permits, and maintenance logs from 2015, reconstructing who had legitimate reason to be near the property and when. One name surfaced repeatedly, overlooked not because it lacked relevance, but because it had seemed too ordinary. Advancements in forensic science filled gaps the original investigation could not. Soil analysis revealed a distinct mineral composition in the jacket fibers that matched a rural property outside Durango land, later owned by the same adult who had assumed legal guardianship over Elise and Ralph shortly after their disappearance. Shoe tread databases, now digitized and searchable, identified the footprint pattern as consistent with a specific work boot issued to employees in a regional utility trade. Employment records confirmed the same individual had been issued that exact model in 2014. Digital mapping tools layered old timelines with new data. The investigator charted the abductor's movements against Elise and Ralph's routines, revealing overlaps that no one in 2015 could have seen. There were gaps, hours unaccounted for, travel logs missing entries, precisely where the abduction had occurred. What once looked like coincidence now read as preparation. Financial records added another dimension. Small withdrawals. A vehicle purchase registered under a relative's name. A move executed quietly within weeks of the disappearance. Each detail alone meant little. Together, they formed a pattern of control and concealment that explained how 2 adults could vanish without triggering immediate alarms. The biometric match reframed everything. The prints did not belong to a suspect returning to the scene. They belonged to the victims themselves. Elise and Ralph had not left no trace. They had been forced to leave themselves behind. With evidence converging across decades, the investigator made the determination to officially name the abductor as the primary offender. The individual was deceased, beyond prosecution, but no longer beyond accountability. The case status was updated. The language changed from missing to abducted, from unknown to known. The final step was the most delicate. The investigator prepared to contact 2 people who had lived entire adult lives without knowing who they truly were. The truth, once delivered, would not restore what was lost, but it would return something essential that had been stolen along with their freedom identity. The notification did not come all at once. Law enforcement approached Elise and Ralph carefully, framing the meeting as a review of routine records connected to the biometric submission. When the truth was finally laid out, it arrived in fragments, each one destabilizing what they believed about themselves. The investigator explained that their fingerprints matched evidence from an unsolved abduction in Durango, Colorado, dated October 2015. 2 missing adults, a couple, their ages aligned. The names were spoken slowly, with care. Shock set in first, then resistance. Elise felt a physical tightening in her chest, as if the room had lost air. Ralph focused on small details, the edge of the table, the sound of the investigator's voice, anything to avoid the collapse of the life he had constructed. Denial followed, not as refusal, but as protection. The idea that their memories were incomplete, that their identities were built on false foundations, was too much to absorb at once. DNA testing was offered as confirmation, not as accusation. Samples were collected from surviving relatives in Colorado, parents, a sibling, a cousin who had never stopped wondering. The wait stretched for weeks, time thick with dread and anticipation. When the results came back, they were unequivocal. The genetic markers confirmed direct biological relationships. Elise Hill and Ralph Allen were alive. They had been missing for decades. The first reunion was arranged quietly, without media, without ceremony. It took place in a neutral room, plain and softly lit. When Elise entered and saw her mother, recognition did not come through memory so much as instinct, the curve of a smile, a familiar tension in the jaw. Ralph noticed the way his father held his hands when he was nervous, a gesture he himself shared without ever knowing why. These small, undeniable details bridged the gap that years had torn open. Emotion moved unevenly. There was relief so intense it bordered on pain. There was anger, sharp and disorienting, directed at the person who had taken them and at the systems that had failed to find them sooner. There was grief for the years that could not be recovered, for graduations missed, holidays marked by absence, lives lived in parallel rather than together. No one knew how to hold all of it at once. As conversations unfolded, fragments of early memories surfaced. A bedroom window facing trees, the smell of pine and cold air, a jacket worn on cool evenings. These details, once unanchored, found their place. The past did not return whole, but it began to make sense. The investigator watched quietly as the family navigated this fragile new reality. The case file would soon be closed as resolved, its administrative arc complete, but the human work had only just begun. Elise and Ralph now carried two lifetimes within them, the one stolen and the one endured. Integrating them would take years, perhaps the rest of their lives. When the meeting ended, there was no sense of finality, only the understanding that truth, even delayed, had the power to reframe everything. Names had been restored, connections reestablished. The silence that had defined so many years was finally broken, replaced not by answers to every question, but by the certainty of who they were. With the truth established, the case entered its final administrative chapter. The records were formally amended to reflect what the evidence now made undeniable. The disappearances of Elise Hill and Ralph Allen were reclassified as a double abduction. The name of the offender was added to the file as the primary responsible party, supported by forensic linkage, documented access, and a reconstructed timeline that left no reasonable alternative explanation. Though the abductor was deceased and beyond the reach of prosecution, the act of naming carried weight. It shifted the narrative from mystery to accountability. Questions remained, and some always would. Investigators could outline how the abduction happened, but not fully why. Whether the motive was control, opportunity, or something darker was ultimately unknowable. There were moments where earlier intervention might seem possible in hindsight, but the reality of the era mattered. Limited technology, fragmented records, and assumptions about adult disappearances created blind spots that were not unique to this case. They were systemic. What this case did make clear was the value of preservation. Evidence collected imperfectly in 2015 photographs, fibers, partial prints had survived long enough to speak decades later. The witness who doubted their own memory had been documented, not dismissed outright, allowing modern investigators to reinterpret their account with new context. The box that stayed on a shelf, moved but never destroyed, became the quiet hinge on which justice eventually turned. For Elise and Ralph, closure did not arrive as triumph. It came as recognition. Their identities were returned, officially and personally, restoring a lineage that had been severed. Family histories could be corrected. Names could be spoken without uncertainty. Grief remained, now layered with anger and mourning for lost years, but it was no longer undefined. The case stands as a reminder that truth is not bound by time. That systems, when designed to learn and connect, can recover what was once thought gone. And that justice, even delayed, can still reshape a life by restoring dignity and understanding. In Durango, the seasons continue to change. The apartment building still stands, unremarkable to those who pass it. Inside police archives, the file is now closed, its story complete in ways no one in 2015 could have imagined. The harm cannot be undone, but it has been named. And sometimes, that is how healing begins. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.